Welcome back to Tartan Lullaby. I'm Archie, and tonight there's a long, quiet story waiting for you. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Find your pillow. Soften your shoulders. Let the day go. Tartan Lullaby tells slow stories of Scotland. Real places, real years, real people, told gently enough to fall asleep inside. There's no music tonight, and no need to follow every word. If you drift off in the first few minutes, the rest will play on quietly without you. That's how it's meant to be. If these stories are a quiet corner you find yourself returning to, a subscription would mean a great deal, and it helps us keep making them. The artwork you see throughout tonight's story is available as a print in our Etsy shop, if you'd like to bring a little of Scotland onto your walls. When you're ready, close your eyes and we'll begin. Tonight, the story of football before football, the ancient game and the long Scottish road to the rules we know. This is Tartan Lullaby, sleep history from Scotland. Let the night settle around you. Let whatever day you have carried dissolve at the edges. What follows is old, older than any stadium, older than any league. We are going back to a time when the rules did not exist and the game was something else entirely. Picture a borough in Scotland, late autumn. The kind of evening where the sky has gone out early and the cold has weight to it, pressing down through the closes and along the edges of the buildings. Stone underfoot, the smell of peat smoke drifting from every door. The lanes are nearly empty. A few figures move with purpose, heads down, cloaks tight. A candle shows in an upper window and then is gone. The only sound is the wind working its way between the buildings and the distant knock of a shutter that was not latched properly. Somewhere behind you, the town is quieting for the night. The market stalls have been packed away. The day's argument and commerce and cold have all come to their end. And here you are, standing at the edge of a darkness that stretches back a very long way. This is where we begin, not in Edinburgh, not in Glasgow, not in any place yet named on a modern map of association football. We begin further back than that. We begin with the simple fact that people have always kicked things. There is something in the foot and something in a round object that produces an almost immediate desire. You see it in children before anyone teaches them. The ball rolls, the foot connects, the ball travels. That is the whole of it. That impulse is as old as the species. Long before anyone wrote it down, long before anyone built a field or a fence or a set of posts, people were playing with balls. The materials changed, the rules changed, the meaning changed, but the gesture itself, that kick, that trajectory, that shared watching of where the thing goes, that never did. So when we trace the history of Scottish football, we are not really tracing something that began in Scotland. We are tracing a thread that runs back through northern Britain, through the continent, through the ancient world, to a point where it becomes indistinguishable from the nature of human play itself. Settle in now. We have a long road behind us before we reach the one ahead. Let the cold outside the window mean nothing. Let the night be the right size for this story. It is. The records suggest that in ancient Greece, Somewhere around the 5th century before the Common Era, there was a game played with a ball on a rectangular patch of ground. The Greeks called it ipiskiros, which we might translate roughly as something shared, something passed between people. It was not football as we would know it. There were teams, and there was a ball, and there was a line scratched in the earth between them. The aim, as far as we can piece together, was to throw or drive the ball over the line behind your opponents. Hands were likely as common as feet. But the shape of it matters. Two sides, a contested space, a ball with nowhere to go but through the other team. Those bones are recognizable. Those bones are still there in any park on a Saturday morning, under all the layers of rules and history we have placed on top of them. The Greeks valued ipiskiros modestly. It appears in their art and in their passing descriptions. A few lines here, a figure on a vase there. It was not one of the great Pan-Hellenic disciplines. It was simply a thing people played, unremarkable in the way that common things are unremarkable. It crossed into the Roman world, as many Greek things did. The Romans took it, changed it, gave it a new name and some new characteristics. They called their version harpastum, which carried the sense of something seized, something snatched. Harpastum was a rougher game by most accounts. Smaller teams, more physical. The ball was smaller too, harder, easier to grip and harder to track. Players could feint and dodge and use their bodies against one another in ways that would not have surprised anyone watching a contact sport today. The Roman legions carried harpastum with them. That is the important fact here, not the rules of the game, not its precise scoring, not even its exact shape. What matters is that it moved. It moved with the armies, north and west, along roads that the legions cut through landscapes that had never seen them. Britain was part of that movement. The legions reached the south of the island, and then they pushed further, and they built the wall, and they looked north at what they could not hold. Caledonia, the Romans called it, the Northern Territories, the place that stayed unconquered. Whether the Romans brought ball games to the north beyond the wall is uncertain. The records do not tell us clearly, but they brought them to Britain, and Britain received them alongside everything else the occupation carried: roads, towns, habits, the particular rhythms of garrison life where men needed to pass the time. The legions were gone by the early 5th century, but habits do not leave when armies do. Games persist. They simplify, they lose their Latin names, they fold into the life of the people who stayed. Something remained in the soil of Britain after the Romans departed, even if no one called it harpastum anymore. What we are left with in the centuries after is the ghost of something, not a documented game, not a set of rules, but a habit, a tendency, the ball, the kicked thing, the contested ground. It shows up again and again across Northern Europe in forms that suggest continuity without proving it. In Brittany, there were early forms of folk ball. In Normandy, in the English lowlands. Across the Celtic fringe, references surface in law codes and in church complaint alike to the playing of ball games on feast days and holy days. Always in those records, there is the same tone: the authorities are trying to stop it. That is perhaps the clearest evidence we have that these games were real and widespread. When something appears repeatedly in records of prohibition, it is usually because people could not stop doing it. The game must have been vivid enough and common enough to keep drawing the attention of those who wished it would go away. And what was this game? It varied. Every village had its own version, its own field, its own number of players, its own tolerance for violence. There were no printed rules. There were no referees in any formal sense. There was custom, and there was the shape of the land, and there were the men who turned up on the day. In many places, the ball games of the medieval period were not games at all in any modern sense. They were more like organized disagreements. Two ends of a town, sometimes two villages, sometimes two parishes, sometimes two trades, facing each other across a street or a field or a stretch of open common. The object was to drive the ball to a point, a doorway, a market cross, a river, the far boundary of the playing ground. A team might number a dozen men, or it might number several hundred. The space between them might be a quarter of a mile, or it might be the entire length of a town. There were no clear positions. There was no offside. There was very little that was not permitted. Men pushed, shoved, carried, kicked, wrestled the ball from one another by almost any means available. The ground itself was part of the game, and the game spread into alleyways, over walls, across streams. These festival games, as historians tend to call them, happened at particular times of year. Shrove Tuesday was common across much of Britain. The period before Lent, before the long abstinence, was marked by excess and noise and physical contest. The ball game was one expression of that, a last expenditure of winter energy before the quiet. In Scotland, the evidence for these early games is sparse but present. The records suggest ball games were played in the boroughs and on the common ground outside them, though the exact form they took is often impossible to recover. What survives is mostly prohibition and complaint, which tells us the games existed, but not what they looked like from the inside. Imagine one of those games. A morning in February, the ground half frozen, the grass pale with the remnants of a frost. Men gathering not in any organized way, but simply arriving, drawn by custom and by the knowledge that this is the day it happens, as it happened last year and the year before. No whistle, no pavilion. A ball, probably of leather, probably irregular, possibly stuffed with something that made it heavy and unpredictable. Two sides defined by geography or kinship, or the accident of where you happen to be standing when the game began. A distant marker that counted as the goal, if goal is even the right word. The game lasted as long as it lasted. It ended when the ball was driven home, or when the light failed, or when enough men were too tired or too hurt to continue. There was no score in any written sense. There was a result, felt and remembered, but not recorded for any posterity. What made a man good at this game? Not skill in the modern sense, not ball control or technique. Size helped. Determination helped. The ability to stay on your feet when several other men were trying to remove you from them. Local knowledge of the ground. A certain comfort with pain. And yet, even within this chaos, even within something that looks from a distance like a riot with a ball at the center of it, there were customs. There were things you did not do. There were understandings, unwritten, unspoken in any formal way, but present. The game had a shape, even when the shape was rough. That is the thread we are following, not the specific rules, not any single game or place or time. The thread is the underlying impulse towards structure, the way that even the most violent, most chaotic folk game contains within it the seed of something that wants to become organized. Across Europe through the medieval centuries, the game kept going. It had different names in different places. It was complained about in different languages by different authorities, but it persisted. It persisted because it answered something, because the kicking and the running and the shared contest of a ball across a field meant something to the people who played it. What it meant is harder to say, not competition in the modern professional sense, not entertainment in the modern passive sense, something more participatory than that, something that involved the body and the ground and the season and the presence of your community all at once. A ritual with mud on it. The cold is coming through the window now. You can feel the edges of the room settling. Outside, somewhere, the wind is still moving in the same direction it has always moved, west off the Atlantic, over the hills, over the old playing grounds, over all the fields where no records were kept. Bring the night in a little closer. We are not done with the ancient world entirely. There is one more thing worth saying before we move north and forward into Scotland's own particular story. The ball games of the Greeks and Romans and the festival games of medieval Britain are not the same game. The line between them is not straight. There is no clear inheritance, no proven chain of transmission from Episkyros to Harpastum to the Shrove Tuesday chaos on a lowland Scottish street. What connects them is not documentary evidence, but something less tidy, a tendency of the species, the fact that wherever you find people with enough time and enough space and something round, you find a version of this. The ball game is not a Roman import or a Greek invention. It is something older than either. And Scotland received it the way Scotland received most things, slowly, on its own terms, shaped by the particular landscape and the particular temperament of the people. The hills did not make for easy open play. The winters were long and the frost arrived early, but the impulse was the same. On the high ground above a barrow, on the common land outside a market town, on the frozen margins of a loch in February, men gathered with a ball, in the way men had gathered with balls before them, in the way men would gather with balls long after the rules were finally written down. The game was already old. It was old before anyone in Scotland thought to write a rule for it. It was old before the first complaint was entered in any Scottish record. It was old in the way that rain is old, in the way that winter is old, in the way that the desire to push something forward and watch it go is old. Rest now for a moment. Let that settle. The ancient world is receding into the dark behind us. The Greek fields, the Roman garrisons, the mud of 1,000 unnamed European festival days. All of it is there, beneath everything, like a layer of earth under the modern ground. The fire in the grate, if you imagine one, has burned down to a steady red. The candles are low. The town outside is fully quiet now. Only the wind, only the stone, only the cold that the building is holding at bay with all its mass. You are rested enough to continue, and we are moving forward now just a little. The next part of the story stays in Scotland. The records are thin, but they are real. The complaints are on paper. The names of actual places are beginning to appear. Sleep is not far. It is in the texture of the air, in the weight of the blanket, in the way the mind is loosening its grip on the day. The history is still here if you want it. It will not go anywhere. It has been here for centuries already. Just this, before the clubs were formed, before the pitches were marked, before any set of written rules existed, there was a game. It was played in Scotland as it was played across Europe. It was called different things in different places, and it looked different on different days. But it was recognizably the ancestor of what came after. The ball was round. The ground was cold. The men who played were real, even if their names are gone. They kicked the thing and ran after it and shoved each other in the frost and went home when the light failed. They did not know they were the beginning of anything. That is how it usually is. The things that become enormous and formal and watched by millions always begin with someone who had no idea. Someone who just wanted to kick something on a cold morning because the impulse was there, because the ground was flat enough, because it was that time of year. The story of Scottish football begins there, in that anonymous cold, in that unrecorded game, in that old impulse that the Greeks noticed, that the Romans carried, that the medieval church complained about, that no one could stop and no one really wanted to. Let the wind outside settle. Let the stone of the walls hold the cold where it is. Let the dark be dark. We have established where all of this comes from. We know the shape of the thing before it had a name. Now, in the hours ahead, we will follow it into Scotland's own story. The rest can wait until morning. The history has been here a long time and it will still be here. You have carried enough of the day already. Let it all go now. The ancient games, the festival grounds, the frost, the ball, the long road that leads from there to here. Sleep now. The story continues in the quiet. The records begin in ink, not much of it and not always clear. A clerk somewhere by candlelight pressing a quill to parchment because someone had to write it down. The date, the place, the offence, the fine, the game. Scotland's earliest written traces of football are not celebrations, they are complaints. The written record is almost entirely a record of disapproval, which tells you something. You only write a complaint when the thing you are complaining about keeps happening. The 15th century is where the ink first thickens, not the first game ever played, of course. That reaches back further than anyone can say with certainty. But the 15th century is where the paper trail begins and where we start to see, in the margins of official life, the shape of something stubborn. Scotland in the 1400s is a country of borough towns and market days, of kirks and council chambers, of cold stone and wet ground. The land is not yet parcelled as we know it. The borders between parishes shift. The winters are long, the summers are brief. Into that world, football enters the written record not as a sport, but as a problem, a disruption, something done on the common ground when the men should have been doing something else, something the authorities could not quite stop. The most famous early document is not Scottish at all in its origin, but it shapes Scotland completely. In 1314, an English edict under Edward II forbids football in London, citing noise and disorder. The language is irritable. The game, clearly, was already old. Scotland's own parliament catches up a century later. In 1424, the Parliament of James I passes an act. The language is plain. The records suggest it read, in the Scots of its time, that no man play at the fute bowl. The words are simple. The intent is clear. James I was not a man who issued idle instructions. He had spent 18 years as a prisoner in England and returned to Scotland with a reformer's impatience. He wanted his kingdom orderly. He wanted his men trained for war, not wasting afternoons in pointless scrambling. The concern was not moral, it was military. The crown needed archers. It needed men who could hold a bow, draw it cleanly, and loose an arrow with accuracy. Football, in the estimation of the Parliament, was stealing time from that practice. Archery was the technology of war in the 15th century. A trained archer could loose 10 or 12 arrows a minute. An untrained one was useless. The Crown's calculation was simple. Every afternoon spent chasing a ball was an afternoon not spent at the butts. And so the Act of 1424 placed football alongside golf as a forbidden leisure. Both games, in the Parliament's view, were enemies of military readiness. Both games, in the event, proved entirely impossible to ban. The bans are a kind of negative portrait of the game. Read what the authorities wanted to stop, and you begin to see what was actually happening. Groups of men, on common ground, on market days and holy days, playing something physical and uncontrolled, and evidently irresistible. A single ban might mean nothing. A law passed once and never repeated might have worked. But the Scottish Parliament did not pass one football ban. It passed several. In 1457, under James II, the prohibition was renewed. Football and golf were again forbidden. Then again in 1471, under James III. Then again in 1491, under James IV. 4 separate parliaments across 70 years telling people to stop playing football. This is not the portrait of a game being stamped out. This is the portrait of a game that could not be stamped out. There is something almost comic about it, seen from this distance. The Parliament writes the law, the men go home, the next fair day comes, someone drops a ball on the common ground, the game resumes, the Parliament eventually writes the law again. In a Kirk session record from the later 1500s, the texture becomes even more particular. Kirk sessions were the local disciplinary bodies of the Scottish Church, and they concerned themselves with the behavior of parishioners in remarkable detail. Their records are intimate in a way that parliamentary acts are not. A Kirk session might record that such and such a man had been found playing football on the Sabbath. The fine would be noted. The man would be expected to appear before the session and acknowledge his fault. The record would be written into the book. And the next Sabbath, somewhere nearby, the game would go on. The Sabbath was the real battleground. The church had always been suspicious of Sunday leisure. Idleness led to sin. Physical play on the Lord's Day was doubly suspect. Kirk session records from Stirlingshire, from Ayrshire, from the Borders and the Lothians repeat the same offence across the decades. Football on the Sabbath, football in the kirkyard, football against the walls of the church itself. The ball, apparently, had no respect for sacred geography. The men who played it had their reasons or simply did not stop to consider the question. Sunday was the one day they were not working. The field was there. The ball was there. Picture the kirkyard in the late afternoon. The service is finished. The congregation has dispersed, or most of it has. A few men linger at the gate. Someone has a bladder inflated and tied. The grave markers stand in the grey grass. The game begins. The clerk who has to write this down later does so with what we might imagine as weary precision. He is not angry exactly. He has seen it before. He notes the names, the date, the nature of the offence. He writes the fine. He sets down the pen. Outside, somewhere, the game has probably already resumed. The fines were not heavy. This matters. A fine that ruined a man would deter him from repeating the offence. A fine that was merely inconvenient was, in effect, a licensing fee. The records suggest that the same names sometimes reappear in the same session books, paying the same fine for the same offence, season after season. This is not defiance exactly. It is not the gesture of a rebel. It is something quieter and more persistent. It is the behavior of people who understand the rule, accept the mild consequence, and then go back to doing what they were doing. The game was worth the fine. For them, the calculation was not even close. What was the game? The records do not describe it. They name it and condemn it and note the fine, but they do not stop to explain what football actually involved, because everyone already knew. This is the difficulty with early records. They document what the authorities wanted to control, not what they wanted to preserve. We can reconstruct something from context. The game was almost certainly played between large groups, with few if any fixed rules, on open ground. The ball might travel hundreds of yards. Men might pursue it through streets, across fields, between the walls of buildings, over streams. Villages sometimes played against each other. Parishes sometimes played against neighboring parishes. The goals, if there were goals, might be natural features. A doorway, a tree, a standing stone at one end of a common and another at the far side. The boundaries were wherever the players agreed or wherever the ground ran out. The ball itself was various. Inflated animal bladder, wrapped sometimes in leather, sometimes not. The weight and shape were unpredictable, so was the bounce. So often was the outcome. The game ended when someone decided it had ended, or when the light failed, or when enough men had gone home. In the borough records, a different picture assembles. The boroughs were the market towns, and they had their own councils and their own concerns. A borough council worried about trade and order and the upkeep of the town's fabric. Football came to their attention when it damaged something. Windows most likely, stalls overturned at market, a cartload of goods scattered, a man knocked down in a narrow close. The Borough Council of Aberdeen in the late 1400s is among those that records concern about football played in the streets of the town. The language is administrative rather than theological. The worry is damage and disorder. The candlelit clerk writing the Aberdeen Borough record is not thinking about history. He is thinking about the complaint that came before the council and the decision the council reached, and the need to note it accurately so that if the matter comes up again, there is a record. He dips the quill. He writes. These clerks are the invisible archivists of Scottish football. They did not love the game. They may have despised it, but they wrote it down, and because they wrote it down, it survived. Every complaint is a preservation. Every fine is a record. The disapproval of the authorities is the only reason we know the game existed. The pattern across these records is consistent enough to be meaningful. The game concentrates on particular days, holy days, market days, fair days, the Sabbath. These are the days when men are not laboring. These are the days when the common ground is free and the light is long enough. The game follows leisure because leisure is what makes it possible. There is something in this that the parliamentary acts do not capture and the Kirk session fines do not capture. The game was not merely a habit, it was woven into the rhythm of the year. The fair came, the game was played. The winter came, the game waited. The spring came, the game returned. By the later 1500s, the parliamentary bans on football had largely ceased to be renewed. This was not because the game had stopped. It was because the military argument had shifted. Firearms were changing the arithmetic of war. Archery was declining as a universal military requirement. The urgency of the ban had receded. What replaced the parliamentary bans were local restrictions, borough ordinances, Kirk session rulings, specific prohibitions in specific places at specific times. The game was not legalized so much as localized in its containment. The national parliament had given up trying to stop it. The local authorities tried to manage it instead. In the Kirkyard records from the later 16th century, there is a gradual change in tone. The fines for Sabbath football continue, but they sit alongside fines for other offences, other disruptions. The session books are thick with the texture of parish life. Football is one item among many. It has been absorbed into the ordinary record. This is a kind of domestication. The game that the Parliament of 1424 had tried to extinguish was, 150 years later, an unremarkable fact of Scottish parish life. Unremarkable enough to be fined without great ceremony, noted without great alarm, and moved past by the clerk with a practiced hand. Think of it this way. The Parliament passed a law, the law did nothing. The Parliament passed the law again. Again, nothing, then again, then again. And at some point, the Parliament stopped passing the law because there was no point passing a law that could not be enforced against something that could not be stopped. The game was stronger than the law, not because the people who played it were lawless or violent, but because the game answered something that the law could not address. It answered boredom and physicality and the need to be in a group doing something together. The law had no counteroffer for any of that. In the borough of Edinburgh in the 1590s, there are records of football being played on the high street and in the closes off the Canongate. The council objects. The game is too physical for a crowded town. People are being jostled. Commerce is being disturbed. The council passes its regulation. The game continues. The records continue. The clerks write it down. Out in the countryside, away from the borough walls and the kirk session books, the game was freer. No clerk was watching every common. No session could summon every player. The rural game left fewer traces because fewer people were there to object to it and fewer still to write the objection down. But the traces that exist suggest consistency. The same game, played the same rough way, in the same rough seasons, by the same rough groups of men. The rules were not written because they did not need to be written. Everyone who played already knew them, because they had grown up watching the game and learning it by doing it. A boy watching the men play on the common in 1460 was watching something that his father had watched, and his grandfather before that. The game was transmitted person to person, generation to generation, without a rulebook, without a governing body, without a name that was consistent from parish to parish. It was football in the Parliamentary Act. It was football in a borough record. It was ball play in a kirk session. The name shifted. The game endured. The ball moved across the ground and men ran after it, and somewhere nearby, if you looked, there was always someone who disapproved and someone else who did not care. There is a texture to the late afternoon game that the records never describe, but that the records allow you to infer. The light going flat. The common ground churned into mud. The men arguing about something or laughing about something. Someone nursing a knocked shin. Someone else retrieving the ball from a ditch. Then the game is over, the way these games end, not with ceremony but with dispersal. One man goes first, then another. The group thins. The common empties. The ball goes under someone's arm or back to wherever it came from. The light is nearly gone. The clerk at his desk does not know this is happening. He is writing down something else, a trade dispute, a debt, a matter of inheritance. He will get to the football complaint when he gets to it. The candle is burning low. The ink is drying on the previous entry. He turns the page. Outside, the town settles into evening. The common is empty now. The marks in the mud where the game was played will be gone by morning or washed away by the rain that is already beginning to fall. There is nothing to show the game happened except the clerk's record, which he has not yet written. He will write it tomorrow. He will write it in the measured language of official complaint, that such men on such a day did play at the future ball contrary to the ordinance. He will note the fine. He will move on. And so it goes into the record, and so it comes to us, not as a moment of joy, not as a scene of color and energy, but as an offense, a fine, a line in a ledger, the game compressed into its own disapproval, the joy entirely absent from the page, but unmistakably present just beneath it. This is what the medieval Scottish record of football amounts to, a century and a half of complaints that tell the same story over and over. People played, the authorities objected, the fine was paid, the game resumed, the clerk wrote it down. The ink faded, the parchment survived, and somewhere in the layers of those small dry records, patient and stubborn and unremarkable, the game waits. It is not yet the game we know, the rules are not written, the clubs do not exist, the pitches are not marked. But the thing that would become all of that is already there, in the mud of the common, in the argument over a disputed touch, in the way a man runs instinctively toward a moving ball on a cold afternoon, because something in him has been running toward it his whole life. The candle goes out, the clerk goes home, the record lies in the dark, waiting to be found. Outside somewhere, the ball is still somewhere on the ground, waiting for morning. Think of a morning in late winter, somewhere in the borders. The sky is the color of dirty wool. The ground is hard where the frost has not yet loosened and soft where it has. It is Shrovetide, the days before the long fast, and something old is about to happen. The village has been preparing since before first light, not with tools or timber, but with the quiet understanding that passes between people who have done this before. Every child knows. Every old woman leaning on her doorframe knows. Today the ball comes out. No one is sure where the ball was made. It is stuffed with something, hay, hair, a bladder. It is heavier than it looks. It has been kept through the year like a thing of value, which in some sense it is. The streets of a Scottish borough in the medieval centuries were not like streets as we understand them now. They were narrow, unpaved, running with water from the closes and wynds above. Pigs moved through them. Children moved through them. Today, the ball will move through them too. The rules, if you can call them that, are simple enough to state and almost impossible to enforce. One part of the town will try to carry or drive the ball to one end. The other part will try to carry or drive it to the other. Everything between is the game. The boundaries are not lines on a field. They are landmarks, a mill, a cross, a stretch of burn where the water runs fast between two stones. To reach your landmark with the ball is to win. The game might last until you do. From the earliest light of the Shrovetide morning, people begin to gather, not at one place but everywhere, filling the streets and the market square and the closes that open onto them. There is no crowd in the modern sense. There is simply the town, assembled and intent. Men and boys from one parish on one side, men and boys from the other on the other. The divisions are old and run deeper than sport. They are the divisions of neighborhood, of kinship, of old arguments no one can quite remember starting. They are real. The ball is brought out. There is a moment before the game begins that the records do not describe well because it is not dramatic. It is simply the moment before. The cold air, the breath of 100 people rising in small clouds, the ball sitting in someone's hands, waiting. Then it moves. At first, the press of bodies is tight, the ball somewhere inside it, invisible. The game has no positions, no formations, no shape that would be recognizable to a later age. It is a mass of people trying to move in different directions, and it is a dense press of effort for the first minute or two, and then it begins to spread. As it spreads, the shape of the town becomes the shape of the game. The ball goes where the streets go. It turns with the alleys. It drops down a close and disappears and reappears somewhere lower. Men who know the town well know how to move through it. That knowledge matters here. Into the burns it goes sometimes, into shallow water running cold and dark between its banks, and the men go in after it because you cannot let the ball rest. The cold of the water is a shock, but it is expected. No one stops for it. To stop is to lose ground. The games lasted from morning until the light went. This is not an exaggeration or a later embellishment. The records from Scottish boroughs are consistent on this point. Hours of hard physical effort across ground that offered every possible obstacle. Stone steps, frozen earth, the sudden drop of a banking into water. By midday there is mud on everything. Faces, clothing, hands, the ball itself so coated it barely resembles what it was at dawn. The town has been rearranged by the passage of bodies through it. A fence broken here, a market stall pushed aside there. This is expected. The damage is part of the day. The injured retire to the edges. A twisted ankle, a cut from a stone, something worse that will ache for a week. They do not leave the street. They watch from where they stand, and they shout for their side, and in this way they stay part of it until it is done. There were women's games too. This surprises people who assume the medieval world did not permit such things, but the assumption is wrong. The records are not generous, but they exist. At Carstairs in Lanarkshire, there is evidence of women playing what was called football in their own contests, on their own terms. The game at Carstairs is not fully documented. We do not know its exact form, or how long it ran, or what the winning condition was. What we know is that it happened, that it was recorded, and that whoever noted it down did not find it remarkable enough to explain at length. It was, apparently, a thing that occurred. This plainness in the record is itself a kind of evidence. A scribe who found something shocking would have said so. The absence of shock suggests these women's games were not unusual. They were part of the fabric of how communities played in Scotland and in other places where similar records survive. Think of those games now. Women in whatever clothing the season demanded, moving across the same kind of ground. Hard lanes, soft fields at the parish edge, the mud of a February market town. The ball the same, the effort the same, the cold the same. Across Scotland, the tradition had different names and slightly different shapes. Shrovetide games were the most common, tied to the church calendar, using the days of license before Lent as a container for something older that the church had never entirely tamed. The timing was convenient. The game was not invented by the church. In some places, the game was played by one parish against another, and the walk from your own kirkyard to the contested ground was part of the event. You arrived as a unit, having travelled together. The game began as a continuation of the walk. There was a social architecture to it that we can still roughly trace. The ball could travel a long distance in these games, half a mile further. Following the ball was to follow the game, and following the game took you across boundaries you would not normally cross, into a neighbouring parish's fields, up a hillside, down to a river bank. In the high passes of the borders in winter, the cold was serious. The ground could be frozen or flooded. The light was short. A game begun at sunrise might be running in near darkness before it ended, the ball darker than the sky, moving by feel as much as sight. The players persisted anyway. This persistence is worth sitting with. These were not men and women with leisure. They worked hard in every other part of the year. Their bodies were already tired by February, and yet the Shrovetide game was not skipped, not reduced, not made more comfortable. It was done in full, in the cold, for the whole day. Something was being honoured, not a rule, not a competition in the formal sense, but a continuity. The same game that your father played and his father before him. The same parishes in opposition, the same landmarks to reach, the same mud on the same streets. This was the point. The language the records use for these games is not always consistent. Football, football, the ball game, la soul in French, accounts from similar traditions across the Channel. The Scots word most commonly found is football, and it appears in contexts that make clear everyone knew what it meant without needing it explained. None of these early accounts trouble themselves with tactics or technique. They record that the game happened, sometimes that someone was hurt, occasionally that the authorities objected. The actual texture of play, the how of it, is left to inference. We infer it from the ground, from the towns, from the distances involved. A game through the streets of Jedburgh, for instance. The town is built on a slope, dropping toward the river. Streets run at angles to each other. A ball moving through this place would gain speed downhill, slow on the climbs, disappear into covered passages, and emerge somewhere unexpected. The town itself was a kind of opponent. Or take a parish game across the fields north of Perth, where the Tay plain is broad and flat, and the wind comes off the estuary without obstruction. Here the ball moves fast, and the advantage is to whoever can sprint across open ground. The game changes its character completely with the landscape it is played on. This is one of the things that makes the history of this game interesting. It was not one thing. It took the shape of where it was played. It took the shape of who was playing it. It took the shape of the season, the weather, the length of the day. It was adaptive in a way that formal sport would later try to prevent. The burns and rivers were frequent obstacles and frequent features. Water meant delay. To cross a burn with the ball was to gain ground, but also to get wet. In February in Scotland, wet meant cold that stayed with you. The burns were not avoided. They were part of the game's character. Sometimes the ball was lost in water entirely. It went under and stayed under, and someone had to wade in to find it. The game paused. The crowd on the banks watched. Then it was retrieved, and the game went on, and the pause was absorbed into the day as naturally as anything else. After the game, there was the walk home. This is the part the records almost never describe, but it is real and worth imagining. The town beginning to empty in the late afternoon, the light going quickly now. Men and boys moving in clusters toward their own closes and houses, the ball back wherever it is kept. The mood of the walk home was not what the mood of the game had been. The effort had been made and was finished. The body was tired in a way that was not entirely unpleasant. The cold, which had been ignored for hours, was felt again. People walked quietly or spoke quietly, as people do when the day has been full. Candles behind shuttered windows, a smell of something cooking, the town resuming its winter ordinary self around the men who had just spent the whole day taking it apart. The closes absorbed people one by one. The streets were empty again by dark. Now come further north, to Orkney, to a small town on the main island called Kirkwall, where this same tradition did not fade when the centuries pressed on it. It is still there. It runs in winter on 2 days of the year, through the streets of the old town, under the shadow of St. Magnus Cathedral. The bar at Kirkwall is not a reconstruction. It is not a revival or a reenactment. It is the thing itself, continuing. The same general shape, uppies against doonies, one end of the town against the other, a handmade leather ball moving through the streets for hours until one side gets it to their goal. It is played on Christmas Day and New Year's Day. The streets are closed. The ball is thrown in at the Mercat Cross and it goes where it goes. Into shops, into gardens, down to the harbour, back up again. The town becomes the game as it always has. Men who play the bar have fathers who played the bar and grandfathers who played it, and the line runs back without a visible start into whatever first occasion a ball was brought out and one part of Kirkwall faced another. The continuity is not symbolic. It is literal and human. This is why the bar matters to the earlier history. It shows us what survival looks like, not in a document, not in a record, in the bodies of people who still do the thing, on the same ground, in the same cold, for the same reason that has never quite been put into words. Other Scottish towns had their own versions. Scone, near Perth, had a long tradition of Shrovetide play. The game there divided married men from bachelors, which is a different kind of social partition than parish against parish, but serves the same structural purpose, a line to stand on either side of, a reason to push. The evidence from Scone is fragmentary. We know the game existed. We know it was played on the same kind of large-scale, over-extended ground. What we do not know in detail is how it ended, which goal was which, what the tradition of the ball itself was. The records are thin where we most want them to be thick. At Inveresk, in Midlothian, there are accounts of similar festival play, the village and parish ground serving as the field, the game moving, as always, with no particular containment. The calendar occasions that produced these games were not uniform across Scotland. Communities adopted and adapted as suited the local custom, the local landscape, the local disagreements. Think of Scotland in the 12th and 13th centuries as a place where these games were simultaneously everywhere and nowhere in the official record. The church noted them occasionally, usually when something went wrong. The crown noted them occasionally when they alarmed the authorities. Otherwise, they simply happened, absorbed into the ordinary annual cycle of hard-living communities that needed no official permission to play. The violence question is the one that later writers returned to most often, and it is fair. People were hurt in these games. The ground was unforgiving. The press of bodies was real. There were occasional deaths, not frequently but not never, and the authorities used this fact when they wanted to suppress the game for other reasons. But the framing of the medieval game as primarily violent misses something. The violence was incidental. The point was not to hurt the man on the other side. The point was to move the ball to the mark. The contact was intense, but it had a direction. It was purposeful in a way that pure fighting is not. The men who played these games also worked alongside each other in other months. They were neighbors. They shared wells and fields and the use of common ground. The Shrovetide game was not a war. It was a sanctioned occasion for rivalry that would otherwise have no safe container. The game held something that needed to be held. After the game, people went back to being neighbors. This is recorded in the silence of the subsequent records. No particular escalation of real hostilities, no lasting feuds generated by the day's play. The ball game absorbed the tension, and then the community reabsorbed itself. This is what such traditions are for. The ball itself was a significant object, not precious, not beautiful, but significant. The making of it was a craft, curing the leather, forming the bladder, stuffing it to the right weight. In some communities, the making of the ball was its own event, with its own traditions attached. The ball arrived on the day already carrying meaning. After the game, the ball was sometimes kept as a trophy, sometimes destroyed, sometimes simply stored until the next occasion. In Kirkwall, the bar that ends the game is kept by the man who claims it in the final moments. It goes into his house. His name is known. The bar is his, and that means something permanent. The walks to these games were part of the occasion. Communities coming together in the early morning, from dispersed farms and cottages, converging on a town or a common ground. The walk had a social function. Agreements were made, gossip passed, the day's mood established. You arrived at the game already connected to the people beside you. Children watched from whatever height they could find: walls, cart beds, the steps of a market cross. The game was partly a spectacle and partly an education. You learned what your side was by watching which men your father stood with. You learned the geography of the game by watching where the ball went and why. As the afternoon wore on, the game began to settle toward its end, not with a whistle or a bell, but with the slow attrition of bodies and light. The men who had been in it all day were moving differently by the third hour. Slower, more deliberate, conserving what was left. The young ones, who had energy still, moved to the front. The moment of resolution, when it came, was rarely a single dramatic instant. The ball worked its way toward one landmark and stayed there long enough for the thing to be accepted. There was a recognition that passed through the group, something relaxed. The game was over. The winning side did not make a spectacle of the win as a later age would. There was acknowledgement. There was relief. There might be a shared drink somewhere, a fire to stand around, the brief warm press of bodies that had been competing all day now standing together in the cold. Then the dispersal. The losing side walked home through the same streets as the winners. In a small community, this meant passing the same doorways, the same closes. The loss was in their walk, in their silence, but it was not permanent. The calendar would come around again. The game would happen again. The score, if you could call it that, would be settled or reopened then. The lamplight in the wines was small and irregular as the town settled back after a Shrovetide game. Here and there, a candle in a high window, the smell of tallow, someone moving across a courtyard with a bucket, the ordinary noise of the evening hour resuming. These games connect to something that runs underneath the formal history. Under the charters and the church records and the royal proclamations, there was a Scotland of bodies and effort and seasonal rhythm. The football game was part of that underdocumented life, and it left traces not because anyone thought to preserve it, but because it kept happening. By the later medieval centuries, the game was widespread enough that its suppression required legislation. We will come to those attempts in the next chapter. They tell their own story. You do not try to ban something that has already disappeared. The bans are evidence of the game's persistence, its deepening roots in how communities lived and spent their hardest months. But for now, stay here. Stay in the borders, or in the streets of a Lothian borough, or in Kirkwall on a January morning, the cathedral at the end of the street, and the cold coming off the water of the harbour and the ball in someone's hands, held a moment before the day begins. The frost on the cobbles, the breath of the men gathering at the Mercat Cross, visible in the grey air, the sound of more people coming from the closes, the ball, old leather, perfectly ordinary, waiting to be thrown and caught and lost and found again in the burns and the closes and the fields at the edge of the town. All of this happened, not once, but every year, in place after place, in the centuries before anyone thought to build a ground with painted lines and numbered positions and a clock ticking the minutes down to a fixed end. This was the game before the game knew it was a game. The town will be quiet again by dark, the ball put away, the players indoors, the streets ordinary once more, a little muddier than they were this morning, a fence rail or two the worse for it, but otherwise unchanged. Rest now, the history is still here when you wake. The Reformation came to Scotland in 1560. In the years that followed, a new kind of authority settled over the parishes. The kirk session was its instrument, a court of elders and ministers who met in the church, recorded the sins of the congregation, and called the guilty to answer. It was not, at first, a banning of games. It was something quieter, a disapproval, a watching eye, a ledger being kept. The kirk was not against the body at play. It was against what the body at play tended to produce, the broken Sabbath, the quarrel that turned bloody, the ale that ran too freely before the ball was even thrown. The games continued. Of course they did. A centuries-old habit does not dissolve because a minister disapproves. In the parishes of lowland Scotland, the autumn and winter festivals still gathered men into the muddy ground. The old rhythms were stubborn. They had been in the blood longer than the Reformed Church had been in the stone. But the Kirk watched, and it wrote things down. In January of 1656, a session minute recorded what had happened on Fasting's Eve in one Scottish parish. There had been football, there had been drunkenness, there had been fighting, men and women both. The session named names, and the named were made to stand before the congregation. The game itself was not the sin in their accounting. The disorder was the sin, the Sabbath breaking, the unruly flesh. That detail is worth sitting with. Men and women both. The game had never been only for men, even then, even in a century when the Kirk was watching. Elsewhere in those same decades, the record shows a game at Carstairs in Lanarkshire, 1628, women playing football, a church document, not a celebration, but a complaint. The complaint is the proof. You do not write a thing down unless it happened. These were not organized leagues. There were no fixed teams, no agreed boundaries, no referee standing at the edge with a whistle. There was a ball, a loose gathering of people, two ends that served as goals, and a cold field at the edge of a village. That was all. That was enough. The game breathed in whatever air the season gave it. The winter festivals were its natural home: Shrovetide, Christmas, New Year's morning, the old quarter days. These were the moments when the ordinary routine cracked open and something older came through. The ball was thrown up, and the crowd surged, and for an hour or two the rules were what the crowd decided they were. Then the crowd thinned. The people walked home in the failing light. The field went quiet, holding only the marks of boots in the soft ground, and the sky above the village went from grey to dark, as it always had. In Aberdeen, in 1636, a schoolmaster wrote about football in a Latin grammar book. He was not celebrating it. He was using it as an example of something, a word in a lesson, a scene the boys would recognize. The boys of Aberdeen Grammar School knew the game already. They had been playing it, no doubt, for as long as they had been getting muddy in the streets outside their fathers' houses. That a schoolmaster recorded it at all is the point. The game was ordinary enough to be used as an illustration, ordinary enough to appear without explanation in a book meant for children. Up in Orkney, on the islands where the Norse had left their mark in the place names and the wind, a different tradition kept its own pace. In Kirkwall, the people played the bar. Two sides, the uppies and the doonies, one from the top of the town and one from the harbour end, and a leather ball between them, and the streets of the old stone town as the field. It was not a delicate game. It was a mass of bodies pressing and heaving, the ball sometimes buried deep inside a crush of men, sometimes breaking free and running briefly down the cobbles before the crowd closed around it again. It could last for hours. There were no written rules. The traditions were older than anyone living could say. The records suggest the Kirkwall Bar was already an established custom by the 18th century, though its roots are generally said to reach back into the medieval period and perhaps further into the Norse centuries. No one wrote down the year it began. Some things begin too slowly and too naturally to have a beginning that can be fixed to a date. Across Scotland in those long Reformation centuries, the game persisted in forms like this: village against village, parish against parish, the unmarked ground between two ends, the afternoon wearing down toward dusk. The kirk disapproved of the fighting and the drunkenness and the broken Sabbath, and it said so in its minutes. The people played anyway and were sorry afterward, and played again the following year. This is what survival looks like sometimes, not a grand defiance, just the quiet insistence of a thing that people like to do. The 18th century was a gentler time for the game in some respects. The worst of the Reformation's strict discipline had softened. Sabbatarianism still had its champions, but the sessions were not always so vigilant, and the old festival days still drew their crowds. The game was embedded in the social fabric now in a way that made it difficult to extract. In 1724, in one Scottish town, the authorities confiscated a drum that had been used to announce an annual football game. The confiscation was meant to stop the game. The fact that a drum had been used at all suggests the game had its own ceremonial weight, its own acknowledged place in the calendar. Someone thought it important enough to announce with percussion. Taking the drum did not, in any likelihood, end the game for very long. By the time the 18th century was well underway, Scotland was changing in ways that had nothing immediately to do with football, but which would come slowly to change everything. The first Turnpike Road Act had appeared in 1713, and by the 1750s, the roads were spreading outward from the lowland towns in a way that Scotland had not seen before. Edinburgh, Glasgow, Perth, Dundee. The coaches began to move faster between them. Roads are not merely physical things. A better road changes how long it takes to reach a market, and how far a man might walk on a free afternoon, and how news travels between one town and the next. The world had been getting larger for centuries. Now it began to get smaller. Along the Clyde Valley in the 1780s and 1790s, the cotton mills were rising. Paisley and the towns around Glasgow were becoming places of a new kind of work. The loom and the spindle had been family tools, operated at home, at the pace a family could manage. The mill was something else entirely. It ran to its own rhythm. It ran to the wheel turning and the clock on the wall. In Dundee, the linen trade was old, older than living memory, but now it was growing into something industrial. In Galashiels and Howick and the border towns, the woolen mills were finding their form. Aberdeen had its linen and its fish. Scotland was weaving itself into a new shape, thread by thread, and the sound of it was the sound of water turning a wheel and the shuttle going back and forth in the dark of the shed. This was not an instant transformation. It took generations. A man born in a village in 1760 might die having seen his son walk into a mill town at 18 and never walk back out again. The shape of life was changing, and the games that belonged to the old shape of life were changing with it, or not changing, and therefore becoming strange. The folk game had always been a creature of open space and common land. You needed ground that belonged to no one in particular, or to everyone in general, ground that a crowd could occupy without trespass. The lowland town still had its links, the open grass on the edge of the built streets where people walked and children ran, but that ground was never entirely secure. At Leith, outside Edinburgh, there were links that golfers had been using since the 15th century. The same open ground. Golf had its written rules now since 1744, when the Company of Edinburgh Golfers had set them down for a competition at Leith. Football had nothing of the kind. The golfers marked their course. The footballers used whatever ground was free. This was one of the small, quiet differences accumulating in that century. Golf was becoming organized and measurable and transferable. A man who had learned the game in Edinburgh could travel to St. Andrews and understand the course, because the principles were written down. Football was still local, still customary, still dependent on what the local crowd agreed upon before the ball was thrown. The schools had the game too. We know it from Aberdeen in 1636, and the evidence suggests the pattern held elsewhere through the following century. In the grammar schools and the borough schools, boys played in the yards and on the open ground near the buildings. They played with whatever rules they had been taught by older boys, who had been taught by older boys before them, an oral tradition of play handed down in scraps and shouts. No one in those years sat down to write the rules of the game as it was played in a Scottish school. The rules were in the air, not on paper. If two schools played each other and one school's customs differed from the others, they argued it out at the edge of the field before they began, and the game was played under whatever compromise they reached, and then the compromise was forgotten by the following week. This was not a failure. It was simply the character of the game at that time. It had not yet needed to be written down. Writing things down implies a game that will be played with strangers in unfamiliar places by people who share no common customs. That game was coming, but it was not here yet. The trainant to Cockenzie Wagonway had opened in 1722, a wooden rail track in East Lothian carrying coal from the pits to the harbour. It was a local thing, a practical thing, built for coal and not for passengers. But it was rails, and a wheeled vehicle running on rails, and that combination would not remain local or practical for very long. By 1808, the Kilmarnock and Troon Railway was open, horse-drawn, again carrying coal, again linking a mining area to the sea. The horses walked steadily along the track, and the coal moved faster than it had moved by road, and the men who owned the mines found this satisfactory. The idea was spreading. Steam was already in the air, not metaphorically. The engines were running in the mines, pumping water from the shafts, turning the mechanisms of the mills. It would not be long before someone put steam to the rails, and when that happened, the speed of everything would change again, and change it in a way that would make the turnpike roads seem slow and the horse seem antiquated. Scotland in the early decades of the 19th century was a country poised between two worlds. In the borders and the highlands and the island parishes, the old rhythms were still largely intact. Men came together on the festival days and played their ball games in the familiar fields. The kirk still kept its eye on the proceedings. The ball was still made by hand, stuffed with whatever was available, and it still moved through the air in the same crooked, unpredictable arc it had always moved. But in the Clyde Valley and the textile towns and the port cities, the clock on the mill wall was setting the rhythm now. A man who worked 14 hours at a loom did not have the afternoon free. He had Sunday, if the Sabbath laws allowed him even that, and he had the brief gaps between shifts, and he had the holidays that the mill owner chose to grant. His leisure was rationed in a way that his grandfather's had never been. And yet the game persisted. In the mill towns too. In the evenings and on the holidays, men gathered on whatever open ground remained near the streets of the new town, and they played. The game adapted. It had always adapted. It had been adapting since the first medieval crowd had chased a ball down a muddy field with no particular purpose beyond the pleasure of chasing. What was beginning to change in those early decades of the 19th century was the question of what a game needed in order to cross from one place to another. As men moved from village to town, and from town to town, looking for mill work or dock work or railway work, they carried their customs with them. But customs from different places did not always agree. A man from Fife who had played football in a certain way might find himself working alongside a man from Lanarkshire who had played it differently. Neither set of customs was written down. Neither set had a name. They were just the way you played, the way everyone in your village had always played. And now you were not in your village. This created, gradually, a need that had not existed before. Not a pressing need, not a crisis, just a gentle friction at the edges of the game, a growing sense that some things might benefit from being agreed upon and fixed. The teams were smaller now in some places. The old mob football of 100-a-side was still alive in Kirkwall and in Jedburgh, and in a few other towns where the tradition was strong enough to hold its shape. But in the schools and on the open ground near the new towns, the game was often played in groups of 20 or 15 or fewer. Smaller teams meant the game moved differently. Smaller teams meant you could almost see where the boundaries were. Boundaries were the first thing that needed to be agreed. Before rules about handling or rules about fouls or rules about how many players, before any of that, there had to be an answer to the simplest question: where does the field end? The old folk game had no answer to this question because the field was wherever the crowd happened to be. But the smaller game, the school game, the game played on a defined piece of ground, needed a line. In Scotland, as in England, these agreements were being made through the first half of the 19th century, not written down as formal codes, but passed from school to school and ground to ground as informal custom. The game was slowly finding its shape, like a river finding its channel, not by design, by the accumulated pressure of many small decisions made by many different people on many different cold afternoons. The records from 1824 show expenses from a football club, suggesting that by that point there were men organized around the game formally enough to keep accounts. A club, a ledger, money spent on something connected to football. It is a glimpse, partial and unreadable in its detail, but it points in a direction, toward organization, toward formality, toward the paperwork that precedes codification. The ground was changing too, in a literal sense. The commons and the links that had served as playing spaces were not permanent. As towns grew, Ground that had been open for centuries was built upon. New streets needed new buildings, and new buildings needed the ground that folk games had used. The game was being pushed to find fixed ground, dedicated ground that would still be there next year. This was another pressure toward organization. If a group of men wanted to keep using the same piece of ground, they had to have some relationship with the people who controlled it. That relationship required a name, an identity, perhaps a written agreement. The informal crowd had no name and no identity. The club had both. Outside the towns, the older game was still itself. In Orkney, the bar still moved through the streets of Kirkwall on Christmas Day and New Year's Day, the uppies and the doonies heaving against each other in the cold harbour wind, the leather ball somewhere deep inside the mass of bodies. In Jedburgh and in some of the border towns, the annual game still drew its hundreds from both sides of the stream or the street, and the old town became briefly a field, and the day was given over entirely to the game. These were not the games that would become modern football. They would go on being themselves. They are still being themselves, in some cases, in Kirkwall especially, where the bar is still played in the same streets in the same way, with the same two sides and the same absence of written rules. There are traditions that are not interested in becoming something else. But elsewhere, in the towns and the schools and the growing cities, something was accumulating. Slowly, without anyone quite deciding it was happening. The railway was a part of this, in ways that would only become apparent later. When the first steam railway in Scotland opened in the 1820s, and when the lines began to spread through the lowlands in the 1830s and 1840s, a new geography became possible. You could be in Edinburgh in the morning and Glasgow in the afternoon. You could carry a team of 11 men from one city to another in a few hours and have them back before dark. That geography made competition between distant places possible in a way it had never been before. It made it necessary to have rules that both sides understood before the game began, because neither side could be expected to know the other's customs. The railway, in this sense, was one of the forces that would eventually make the writing down of rules not merely useful, but unavoidable. But all of this was still in the future. In the 1830s and 1840s, Scotland was a country where the game was played in dozens of different ways, in dozens of different places, and most of those places were not aware of what the others were doing. The grammar school in Aberdeen played one way. The village on the borders played another. The mill workers in Paisley played a third way on their free afternoons. None of them would have said they were waiting for something. They were simply playing in the way that people play, without theory, without organization, without the knowledge that they were part of something larger than an afternoon in a field. But they were. The game was, without anyone quite seeing it, finding its way toward a form that could cross a border, travel a railway line, be understood by strangers in a different city. It was finding the shape that would, eventually, need to be written down. The world was speeding up. The mills turned faster. The railways pushed further into the countryside each year. The cities grew. The newspapers reached more people. Information was moving at a pace that a man from 1650 would have found incomprehensible. And at the edge of all this noise and speed and industry, in the grammar school yard and on the winter links, and in the cold streets of Kirkwall, the old game went on being played. It was not ready yet to become something new, but it was almost ready. The long, quiet centuries were drawing toward their end. In Edinburgh and Glasgow, the middle of the 19th century was bringing a different kind of man to the game. Not the mill worker or the village farmer, but the man who had been to school, who had read books, who had learned to play in the organized yard of a grammar school, or perhaps in one of the English public schools that the sons of better-off Scottish families sometimes attended. These men knew other versions of the game. They had played at school with boys from other towns, and they had noticed the differences, and some of them had found the differences interesting rather than merely inconvenient. They were men who were accustomed to thinking about how things worked, to asking whether there was a better arrangement, to writing things down. This kind of man was not yet dominant in the game. In 1840, in 1845, in 1850, the folk game was still the main event in most of Scotland. But the grammar school man, the university man, the man who had played at a school with a yard and a tradition, was beginning to be a presence at the edge of the game, watching and thinking. The Queen's Park they would found in 1867 was not an inevitable outcome. History rarely works that way, but it was the kind of thing that happens when a particular kind of man, in a particular kind of city, at a particular moment in the life of a country, decides that the game deserves something more than custom. Before that moment, there were the long centuries, the Reformation watching, the Kirk session writing, the drum confiscated in 1724, the boys of Aberdeen Grammar School kicking a ball in the Latin grammar book, the uppies and doonies heaving in the cold Kirkwall streets. The folk game breathed through all of it, unhurried, unwritten, changing slowly in the way that living things change. Scotland stood on the eve of something it had not yet named. The railways ran through the winter countryside. The mill towns glowed at night with lamplight from 100 windows. And somewhere on a piece of open ground at the edge of a city, men were playing with a ball, arguing about the boundaries before they began, almost ready to write the argument down. The city did not arrive all at once. It crept in slowly over decades, along river banks and valley floors, filling in the spaces between older villages with stone tenements, factory walls, and the low constant smoke of coal fires burning through the night. Glasgow grew faster than almost any city in the world. In 1800, it held perhaps 80,000 souls. By 1850, that number had more than trebled. By 1870, it would be close to 500,000. The arithmetic of industry is relentless. The mills needed workers. The workers needed housing. The housing rose in long grey terraces across land that had, not many decades before, been open field and common ground. The commons where men had chased bladders of air were built over, one by one. The Clyde carried it all: raw cotton, finished cloth, coal, iron, timber, tobacco. Ships grew larger, and the river was dredged deeper to receive them. The men who worked the docks and the foundries came from all across the Highlands, from Ireland, from the borders. They brought their games with them, not codified rules and painted lines, but older habits, the kick and chase, the wrestling tackle, the satisfaction of a ball struck cleanly with the inside of the boot. These things cross water easily. The working week was long. 6 days was standard for most trades, and the sixth day ran until late afternoon at the earliest. Leisure, in any organized sense, was a luxury the city had not yet learned to provide for those who built it. But pressure grew. Trade unions pushed for the half-holiday on Saturdays. By the 1850s, it was spreading through certain industries. A concession rested slowly from employers who found, eventually, that a rested workforce worked harder on Monday. The Saturday half-day is a small thing, written that way in the ledgers of labor history, but it is also the hinge on which modern sport turns. Give working men a free afternoon each week, and they will fill it. The question is only with what. The parks came too, almost at the same moment. Glasgow Green had long been common land, but the civic improvements of the Victorian era opened new public spaces, levelled ground, planted trees along paths. The city was building places for its people to breathe. Queen's Park, to the south of the city, was laid out in the early 1860s on land that had once been farm ground. The name came from the street nearby, which took its name from Mary, Queen of Scots. The park had open grass, wide enough to run on. Young men noticed. They had always noticed open ground, but now they had the afternoon to fill, and they had each other in greater numbers, and they had, increasingly, the sense that the games they were playing needed some shape to hold them together. The schools had been part of this. The grammar schools and the new mechanics institutes brought boys together who had read about the games played at English public schools. Rugby and association football were being written into rulebooks in the south. The copies spread north. The Football Association had been founded in London in 1863. It set down laws for a game played on foot, without handling, with a round ball. Scotland read about it in newspapers. Young men in Glasgow discussed it on the walk home from work. Not all of them had access to the newspapers, of course, but knowledge moves through communities in ways that do not depend on literacy alone. One man reads, tells two more. The rules get simplified in the telling. The game that emerges is recognizably the same game. There were kickabouts on Glasgow Green through the mid-1860s. The records are thin, as records of informal play almost always are. No one thought to write down who was there or what the score was, because it was not yet the kind of thing that got written down. But the men playing on the green were watching each other. They were beginning to recognize faces from the previous Saturday. The group was forming loosely, without a name, without officers, without a set of rules pinned to a wall. It was a club before it called itself one. Across the city, in workshops and counting houses and drawing offices, similar clusters were gathering. Young men of the new professional and skilled trades classes, educated enough to want organized competition, physically confident enough to pursue it. They were not the street footballers of earlier centuries, playing through market towns in great unruly mobs. They were something new, men who wanted the game bounded, refereed, repeatable. They wanted to know at the end whether they had won. The weather did not cooperate, as Scottish weather rarely does. The grounds were often heavy. The ball, leather and laced, grew waterlogged in rain and became difficult to control. Players wore what they had. There were no strips, no matching colours, not yet. The rules differed from game to game still. One group played by the London Association rules. Another played a hybrid that allowed some handling. Arguments broke out at the touchline and sometimes on the pitch. The need for a settled code was becoming urgent. Into this moment, in the summer of 1867, a group of young men who had been meeting informally in Queen's Park decided to formalize what they had been doing. They would become a club with a name, a membership, and a commitment to the association rules. They chose the name of the park itself, Queen's Park Football Club. It is, by the records that survive, the oldest association football club in Scotland. The date of their founding meeting is given as July the 9th, 1867. That is the door this episode has been walking toward, not through it yet. The story of Queen's Park, of the rules they kept, and the matches they played, and the journey that followed, belongs to the next chapter of this series. For now, it is enough to stand at the threshold, to see the door, to understand how long and strange the road behind it is, and to feel, in the quiet of this evening, the weight of everything that led to that July afternoon in the south of Glasgow. The ancient games on winter fields, the leather balls sewn by hand, the royal proclamations ordering men back to their bows, the Shrove Tuesday crowds pouring through town gates, the long hush of the rural centuries, all of it tending slowly toward this. Toward a park, toward a summer evening, toward young men deciding, calmly and with some formality, that the thing they loved was worth organizing. That decision is not the end of anything. It is, in every sense that matters, the beginning. The city does not know, in 1867, what it has just made room for. It is busy with other things, the ships on the Clyde, the smoke from the furnaces, the long argument between capital and labor. The football club is a small thing for now. But small things have a way of growing in cities that need them. Glasgow needed it. The men filing out of the yards on Saturday afternoon needed somewhere to put the energy that the rest of the week had not spent. The park was waiting. Let the story rest there for tonight. Let it settle into the summer grass of Queen's Park in the year before anything was decided, when the game was still mostly possibility and the young men were still mostly just young men with a free afternoon. The city quietens now. It does not do this quickly. Glasgow at night in the 1860s is not silent. There are still furnaces burning, still a shift change somewhere along the river, still the sound of iron on cobblestone as a dray horse turns a corner. But the residential streets grow still. The tenement windows darken one by one, each small yellow square of gaslight disappearing as the household retires. From above, if you could see it, it would look like stars going out in reverse order. The gaslights in the street remain. They cast a low amber glow across wet stone, and the light moves a little where the flame inside the glass is not quite steady. A moth, confused by warmth in the wrong season, circles one of them. The Clyde at night is the color of pewter. It holds a faint reflection of the sky, which is not quite dark even now, not in June, when the northern latitude keeps a memory of the sun somewhere below the horizon long after midnight. A barge sits low in the water near the Broomielaw, loaded with coal that will not be unloaded until morning. Its mooring rope pulls gently against the timber of the wharf, a slow creak that carries across the water and then dissolves. A cat moves along the top of a wall near the green. It does not hurry. It pauses, sits, watches something in the shadow below the wall that does not interest it enough to pursue. It moves on. The wall is cold under its feet. The grass of the green is wet. It usually is. A boot print from the afternoon's play is still visible in the soft ground near the center, the stud marks deep and clear, the mud dark around the edges. By morning, it will have softened further. Somewhere to the south, the park that gave a football club its name is also quiet. The paths through it are empty. The broad, flat ground where the games will be played is just grass tonight, ordinary grass, not yet historic, not yet anything but itself. A lamp burns in a window in a tenement near the park. Someone is still awake, a clerk finishing accounts, perhaps, or a mother feeding a child who would not settle. The light is steady. It does not waver. The night outside it does not intrude. In the counting houses and the drawing offices, in the small rooms where young men share lodgings and talk long into the evenings about the things that interest them, the conversations have ended. The voices have gone quiet. The city is breathing slowly now. The arguments about rules, about which code to follow, about whether handling ought to be allowed, about the precise dimensions of the goal mouth, all of that has been set aside until Saturday. There will be time for it then. There is always time on Saturday afternoon. The smoke from the chimneys rises vertically in the still air, thickening the sky above the rooftops into a grey that is neither cloud nor clear. It smells of coal and something else underneath, something older, the damp stone the city is built on. Further out, beyond the terraces, the ground rises toward open country. There are farms still within walking distance of the city center, fields that have not yet been claimed for streets. A dog barks once from one of them and is not answered. The river moves. It always moves. Through all of this, through the centuries of games and bans and winter mobs and royal proclamations, through the building of the city and the coming of the factories, the Clyde has kept moving toward the sea. It carries nothing particular tonight, a few pieces of driftwood, the usual slow cargo of silt and memory, the reflections of the far bank and the amber lights and the dark sky above. It is indifferent to the city's history and entirely beautiful. The men who will found Queen's Park are asleep now, most of them. They are not yet a club. They are individuals, each in their own lodging, each with their own particular silence around them. They do not know what they are about to do. Or perhaps they do a little. Perhaps one of them is lying awake in the dark, turning the idea over, thinking, we should do this properly, we should write it down, we should give it a name. Perhaps that thought is present even now in the quiet. But the thought can wait. The night is the night. The city is the city. The river is moving toward the sea, and the gaslights are burning, and the grass of Queen's Park is wet and cold and ordinary and ready, in its ordinary way, for whatever comes next. History does not announce itself. It arrives in small rooms, in quiet conversations, on unremarkable afternoons. The men who change things rarely know they are doing so at the moment they do it. They think they are just making plans for Saturday. And so the year turns. The summer of 1867 is still ahead. The foundries will run on Monday and Tuesday and the rest of the long working week. The Clyde will carry its ships. The city will add another street, another tenement, another 1,000 people. And on a Saturday in July, a group of young men will sit down together in the south of the city and agree on something. The details of that meeting belong to the next episode. Tonight, we only need to know that it is coming, that it is almost here, that everything in this long story, from the leather balls of the ancient game to the proclamations of the Scots kings, to the Shrove Tuesday crowds, to the slow growth of this enormous industrial city, has been moving toward it. Rest now. The Clyde is dark and quiet, and the gaslights are steady in the amber air, and the grass is wet, and the city is breathing, and the story is not finished, only paused. There is more to tell, and it will keep until you are ready. The next episode of this series will take up the story where tonight leaves off. The founding of Queen's Park, the first matches, the beginnings of the game as Scotland would come to know it. That story is waiting for you. But for now, this is where we leave things, at the threshold. In the quiet of a June night in a city that does not yet know what it is building. The grass wet, the lights amber, the river moving, the long history settling into sleep. Thank you for spending this night with Tartan Lullaby. The story of football in Scotland is only just beginning, and there is much more still to come in this series. Sleep well. Good night. That's where we'll leave it for tonight. The story is finished, but the night isn't, so let this play on as long as it helps. If Tartan Lullaby has been good company, you're welcome to subscribe so the next story finds you. There's no rush. If you'd like to see the landscapes that go with these stories, the art prints are at Tartan Lullaby Art on Etsy, with mood boards and stills on Pinterest under the same name. The links are in the description below. Until next time, thank you for listening. Sleep well, all is well.